Good morning and welcome to the 15th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. We have apologies from Mark Griffin and I welcome Paul O'Kane and Marie McNair who are joining us online. Our first item of business is a decision on whether to take item 5 in private. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Our next item of business today is to continue taking oral evidence on our inquiry into financial considerations when leaving an abusive relationship. So I welcome to the meeting Lynn O'Brien, Chief Officer for Children and Families, Aberlour, Erica Young, Senior Policy Officer, Social Justice Citizens Advice Scotland, and Kirsty McKechnie, Early Warning System Project Manager Scotland, Child Poverty Action Group Scotland. So thank you all for joining us today. And given time is rather tight, we're going to go straight into the questions and I'm going to invite Paul O'Kane in first of all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. The first kind of area that is of interest to the committee is public debt and looking at issues around public debt when it comes to people leaving an abusive relationship. And we know from submissions that Aberlour have done a wide piece of work in this area, not least the kind of pilot in Tayside. So I think we're particularly interested into what is good practice and kind of how do we ensure consistent good practice in terms of how economic and financial abuse is taken into account, when we're pursuing public debt. So I'll maybe start with Aberlour this morning just to get that sense of what you're doing.
Good morning. My name is Lynn O'Brien. I'm Chief Officer for Children and Families, so I oversee all the children's services across Scotland for Aberlour. And have experience of working with women and children facing domestic abuse over many years. So in terms of the public debt issue, we've got experience of women and children who, often through no fault of their own, have accrued debt from ex-partners and are then liable for that debt. And I suppose one of the things that surprised me when I came to Aberlour was how we collect debt from families in Scotland. I know the committee's heard evidence before in relation to that, but actually we have an inhumane system in Scotland in terms of how we collect public debt from families. So at a time when families are really vulnerable, leaving abusive relationships, our systems and processes should be wrapping around families. And instead what happens is they face issues in terms of council tax debt, school meal debt and rent arrears. And actually the collection practices that happen in Scotland mean that they're very aggressive and proactive debt collection practices that further entrench and trap families in debt. And the Tayside project that has been operational for 3 years has shown evidence of how systems and processes can take a much more compassionate approach to families, so they can provide early support to families in terms of financial welfare support, but also the systems change part of it. So actually we don't have to collect debt in a punitive way. We can take a systems approach to doing that and really wrap around our families. And so I heard stories when I was up in Perth recently where a family were facing £30,000 worth of debt, which was avoidable, was 100% avoidable, that if we had contacted that family early and provided support rather than send them to a debt collection agency, their universal credit wouldn't be deducted and the debt would have not spiralled out of control. So there are definitely ways that we can do debt differently, and I think we've also submitted evidence in terms of the deductions that come out of low-income families in Scotland. So on average, it's £1,000 per year that's coming out of families in Scotland's income, which is, again, 100% avoidable.
Thanks, Lynn. I mean, the work in Tayside is definitely interesting. I think the challenge is that there's a kind of patchy approach across the country, and local authorities doing different things. And one of the things that I picked up from the work Aberlour are doing is the need for perhaps a code of practice being kind of codified so that all public bodies are doing similar things and are looking at these issues in the same way. But are there other areas of good practice that you've seen that you would want to identify in this work?
Yeah, we've got examples, as I say, in Tayside where they're taking a systemic approach to working with families where they're experiencing debt. So, as I say, rather than being punitive, it's about being supportive. In some local authorities, we're also seeing local authorities just taking a different approach to families. We had a scenario recently where a woman had overcome significant substance use issues. She came out of our mother and child recovery house and she was facing rent arrears and was unable to move back to her home because she was fleeing domestic abuse, and the rent arrears were preventing the family moving into suitable accommodation. And we were able to work with the local authority to get them to change that practice. So it's not across Scotland. The Tayside example is probably the best example in terms of system change examples, but there are practices where local authorities are taking a very different approach, and we want to see that as part of Equally Safe, actually. That, as you know, if we are signing up to the principles of Equally Safe, then we ensure that public debt is part of that.
Thanks very much. I wonder just, and I can broaden this out to other witnesses as well, you know, in experience, is council tax debt something that councils do consider writing off for, you know, women in particular who are leaving a financially abusive relationship? Or are we not seeing enough progress in terms of how that's happening at a council level? And I suppose the other part of that is, would your view be that we need bigger legislative change in order to make that provision? I don't know if Erica, do you want to maybe comment from a citizens' advice point of view?
Thanks ever so much, Paul. Yeah, we see inconsistent practices, so we do see that some local authorities are prepared to write off the arrears in response to evidence, whereas others will pursue diligence, potentially resulting in the victim survivor having to seek bankruptcy, which is obviously not necessarily a good outcome for that individual. We think that the most effective way to ensure consistent good practice is that code of conduct that's been referred to, and we think there's some lessons that can be learned from the private sector. So Surviving Economic Abuse and UK Finance worked together on a code of conduct, and that will, as it's rolled out, it will support victims to engage in conversations with providers. It will raise awareness of the impact of economic abuse, and it will achieve greater consistency in terms of the support and help being provided by financial institutions to victim survivors. The other key thing that we would like to see is an economic abuse evidence form. So this would be modelled on what we see with the debt and mental health evidence form. So it's an interactive process with an authorised money advisor that then provides that information to local authorities about the situation, and that would facilitate a more consistent practice when it comes to writing off joint and several liability specifically. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. I don't know if Kirsty has anything she would want to add.
No, I'm quite happy to.
Perfect. No, I think that's
the experts.
Yeah, of course, that's been a really helpful start to that, and I think there's plenty for the committee to consider there. Thank you, convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming along. In some circumstances, I understand that victim survivors can be exempt from sanctions. I just wonder, how well do these exemptions work in practice, and can they be improved? Erica, you want to come in?
If I may start off there, Jeremy. Yes, there is a clear sort of guidance on when conditionality requirements or a break from conditionality requirements should be implemented, a total of 26 weeks where children are involved, but that can only be applied once in every 12 months, so it doesn't account for the risk of returning to the abuser multiple times, which we know is a risk. It also doesn't account for the fact that the amount of time it takes to get back on your feet, to stabilise your life, to start rebuilding is very varied from individual to individual. So we think there should be a lot more flexibility around that. And we also find that particularly in the early stages, quite simply, the system is not designing in the needs of victim survivors, and it's not picking up problems at an early stage. So if I can talk you through an example. This is a particularly egregious example, but it's not uncommon. If we call the victim survivor Adele, she missed an appointment while being relocated on an emergency basis by Women's Aid. She had evidence from Women's Aid of the situation, but the DWP nonetheless disagreed that she had a sufficiently good reason for missing that appointment while being emergency relocated. She was also refused a request to attend another appointment at a job centre in her new local authority area. So what that meant is that prevents her then from taking the action required to end the sanction. She felt humiliated, re-traumatised, and of course she was left destitute and reliant upon crisis support. It took the CAB 42 days to resolve the matter and get the sanction lifted. And again, that sort of time frame is not uncommon either. So we think that the DWP really needs to bed in taking the accounts of victim survivors from trust by default, and to embed a more trauma-informed practice into how conditionality operates on the ground.
Do we have two witnesses who want to comment on that?
Yes, please.
Please, thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you. As Erica mentioned, that there is guidance about when exemptions from sanctions or conditionality can be applied, but in addition to it not being allowed within more than one period in 12 months, you also must not be living at the same address as the abuser, and you must provide evidence from a person acting in official capacity. So these rules are really quite stringent. We know that work coaches do have discretion, and we hear anecdotally of some work coaches exercising that discretion and working with care, but we also hear stories where that's not the case. And I think, as Erica says, the DWP needs to move to a much more trauma-informed approach in relation to the exemptions from conditionality.
Okay, thank you. If we can move on to split payments, which I think has been probably talked about since UC came into existence. Obviously, I think we're getting closer to a point where everyone will be transferred across to UC. In regard to your list of priorities of how you want to see you changed, how high up is split payments as a priority? I appreciate there's lots that you want to see change about UC, but you know, in a list of, does it make the top 10, top 5, top whatever?
I think with universal credit, the principle of having individual entitlement for people is so important, and that the thing that changed with universal credit is that all the benefits are rolled into one, whereas families might have been able to split entitlement in the past, and this has completely removed this. It became much more apparent during COVID when people partners lost their jobs or were unable to work and realised that they had no access to an independent income of their own. So we agree that this is really, really important for people, and particularly in cases of domestic abuse. It enables financial abuse at the moment. The difficulty comes in with when you try and split universal credit is that actually it's not as easy as it sounds in principle. And so we appreciate that there are lots of questions that need to be addressed before the payments can be split adequately.
Yeah, I would echo that. We recognise that there are challenges to achieving this, but there is a precedent there with Scottish Choices concerning direct payments to landlords and fortnightly payments. And I think this is a policy that can and will save lives if it's properly implemented. It will enable financial planning to leave the relationship in a way that simply isn't possible at present. And it will also enable financial independence as well. And I think, well, we can all appreciate that it's typical for households to pool income and resources. That ought to be in a way by choice for that particular household to suit their needs, whereas universal credit does not allow that sort of autonomy. It simply is a household payment, and there is no real control in respect of that household as to how they manage that. And at the moment, it is putting women, victim survivors, in danger.
Okay.
So, high priority.
Okay. And just for briefly, because obviously in the Social Security Scotland Act, we also put a statutory thing to put split payments in for benefits that are delivered here in Scotland. And the committee said previously that, as you said already, Chris, it's not as easy as it sounds. And I think there's been quite a long delay because Scottish Government are struggling to work out how to do it. Are there particular benefits you think they should be concentrating on which are delivered here in Scotland, which could be split? And do you know how much progress has been made?
I don't know anything about progress. I'm aware that particularly things like Scottish Child Payment can be problematic where parents have shared custody of children when it's only paid to one parent. That's the kind of thing that could be problematic.
Yeah, I would echo that. We also see problems with delays. There is a very good process in place for managing a transfer, but there can still be delays, and sometimes those delays actually come at a very early stage that isn't related to Social Security Scotland as well. They can come as a result of having to try and qualify for benefits like universal credit and child benefit. Child benefit in particular is one where we see a source of delay. So there would be a limit in that sense in what could be achieved by looking at splitting Scottish Payment specifically. I would at this point circle to the Fund to Leave pilot that we would like to see rolled out nationally across all 32 local authorities and delivered by an agency with relevant expertise, such as Women's Aid, for consistency. That I think is where a lot of the focus could be when it comes to what's delivered in Scotland.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Camilla.
Okay, I believe Bob Doris would like to come in.
Yeah, just very briefly. Morning, everyone. Erica Young, I think you mentioned about financial planning to leave a relationship, an abusive relationship, and we also heard earlier that in terms of getting some discretion from universal credit, the victim survivor must not put the same address as in the same household as their former partner. Is there any mechanism at all within the universal credit system if a work coach identifies or suspects that there is abuse going on, that an application could be made in private in advance and decisions made in principle so that a victim survivor could see what their financial situation would look like if they did decide to leave? Because the idea of leaving in a chaotic situation without any planning and then having all the inbuilt delays that come with universal credit in the first place seems not fit for purpose when someone's in that situation. So has there been any consideration of that at all, or any work going from DWP, or is it something we're looking at, whether it's Social Security Scotland or DWP, it's something we should be starting to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two main issues here. One is that because of the nature of household payments, that if a work coach is concerned that financial or other types of abuse are happening, in order to arrange for an alternative payment arrangement to split that universal credit award, inevitably the abuser is alerted to that because it's via a joint account. There's no possible way of hiding what's happening there. What the DWP will assure advisors is that a change of circumstances advance is available, so when that victim leaves, the payment, there will be an advance available to her on the basis of a change of circumstances, but that still means having to essentially borrow, because that's what an advance is, and at a time when a victim survivor is leaving potentially with absolutely nothing behind them, they potentially may not even have their own bank account at this stage. They may be managing the hangover of debts that have been taken out in the context of economic coercion. It doesn't make for sustainable financial planning. We have victim survivors phoning our Help to Claim service, for example, just to understand how claiming universal credit if they leave, how it works. And so in the context of a household where universal credit is not currently in place, it's the 5-week wait that is then the challenge for the victim survivor. And again, their only recourse is to an advance. So quite often we will see victim survivors having to have recourse to the Scottish Welfare Fund and similar to get through that initial period, and their ability to build up that buffer zone before leaving is just terribly limited.
I think other members will come on to these other aspects. I don't want to step in people's toes, but that's very helpful, Erica. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to invite Marie McNairan. Thanks.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. I found the discussion there around split payments really helpful, and I think obviously talked about the complexity involved. Because what struck me when I was reading the papers, obviously in our SPICE handout was the little amount of households in Scotland. It was 15 households, and overall in UK it was 324. I was obviously totally understandable now, just when you're talking about the complexity involved in that. Can I stay on UC? Obviously in last week's panel asked kind of similar, but obviously the UC, it's obviously the fact that you just spoke about, Erica, is advancement of up to 100% is obviously repayable in full. Obviously, if the repayment advances remain part of the system that emerges from the UK government review, should a case be made that advances should not be repayable in all domestic abuse cases? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Erica. You're okay with that?
Yes, no, I would absolutely support that. I think it's essential. Evidently, our preferred option would be for the 5-week wait to be eliminated going forward, and I think there is quite a straightforward way of achieving that, which would be to provide payments up front based on the indicative UC amount, to be quite technical about it, but that just simply means an advanced calculation of what is likely to be payable at the first assessment period, providing that payment, and then if it turns out that it's slightly more is paid out than what would be awarded at the first assessment period, that could then be clawed back. It would be a much better system than an advance. But yes, failing that, absolutely we would look for a write-offs of advance payments in the context of victim survivors.
Thank you. Can I stay with you for my next question? Obviously, the sort of two-child limit is causing major financial hardship. How common is it for families impacted by domestic abuse to be hit by the two-child policy?
I don't have data on that, Marie, but we know that the number of people at the DWP level claiming the exception of non-consensual conception exception is incredibly low. It's vanishingly small. And that, of course, is because this particular exception is abhorrent, and it really does not design in the needs of victim survivors. And we would like to see it phased out in Scotland, and we think the way that it could be phased out in Scotland would be by not requiring women to have applied to the DWP for that exception in order to benefit from future Scotland Pacific two-child limit mitigation payments. So that would gradually over time phase it out completely in Scotland, although there would still be some people in Scotland in receipt of that exception. Going forward, no women in Scotland would have to apply for it. Now, I do appreciate, obviously, there are other exemptions, and that would capture all of them. But nonetheless, we think this would be one of the best ways of phasing out this appalling policy and protecting victim survivors in Scotland from having to go through that process.
Thank you. Could it be in the interest of time, I'll hand it back to yourself, unless other witnesses in the room are wanting to come in?
I think it's just important to note that whilst we absolutely agree with what Erica's saying in relation to the two-child limit and the two-child limit mitigation, there will be some circumstances in which parents will only get universal credit if they have applied for an exception. So it would be far better that the two-child limit was scrapped at source by the UK government in order so that would scrap it completely, and it would avoid the need for anybody to have to record their situation.
Thank you.
I would just like to support colleagues who are a bit more expert in that field, but Aberlour supports the scrapping of the two-child limit in terms of ending child poverty. And we know that children in poverty who are affected by domestic abuse face further inequalities. So we would support the ending of the two-child limit.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And just touching upon other financial support, and you mentioned it earlier, but how effective and accessible is the discretionary housing payments and also the Scottish Welfare Fund? in supporting people to try and, you know, establish a new home when they're, you know, leaving an abusive relationship. And don't know if Kirsty wants to come in on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Discretionary housing payments are a really good and supportive scheme. However, they are not set up really to help people who are leaving domestic abuse. You can only get a discretionary housing payment if you are already getting the housing element of universal credit or housing benefit. So for people who are leaving, who might not be getting those benefits already, in order to set up a new home, they aren't able to get help through discretionary housing payments for rent in advance or for deposits. And there's a bit of a hole, I think, in entitlement there, because the Scottish Welfare Fund also prohibits grants being made for deposits and rents in advance. So only somebody who is moving from a situation where they're already getting one of those benefits could benefit then from a discretionary housing payment to help them establish themselves in a new tenancy. In addition to that, people are often asked to sign up to a new tenancy really quickly, particularly for things like housing associations. And if there is a delay in moving in, for example, because you're waiting for a community care grant, your universal credit housing element doesn't start until you've actually moved in. So if you have a delay through Scottish Welfare Fund, even if, so on the Spice briefing, the average is 2 weeks, you could be accruing 2 weeks worth of rent arrears before you've even moved in. And because you weren't getting housing benefit, universal credit housing element for that period, you might not be able to get help from a discretionary housing payment to cover that as well. So you're almost effectively starting off in debt. So there's just, whilst those schemes can be really helpful and really supportive in certain circumstances, there's a bit of a gap and an entitlement there that doesn't support people to leave domestic abuse. And that was why we were so keen to work on the discretionary fund to leave pilot with Scottish Women's Aid and Gender.
Okay, thanks, Kirsty. Erica, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just echo everything that Kirsty said, and I would add to that that we do see some rent deposit guarantee schemes, but they're quite patchy. Some local authorities will have them, some won't. They're often a good option when they are available, so it might be worth looking at whether that could be something that's more consistently rolled out. I would also point out the support with housing costs for private renters via Reserve Social Security has been really, really squeezed due to a combination of cuts and freezes. Originally it was 50th percentile of local rents, now 30th. 7 years of freezing, it's now been frozen again for the latest financial year. And research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies just before, admittedly, there was 1 year of inflationary uplift, but nonetheless, suggested that just 1 in 20 private lets are on the market at rental levels that would be supported fully by Social Security. So it's quite a significant shortfalls, and where DHPs can meet those shortfalls, it's for short periods of time, usually 6 to 8 weeks, which is just not an adequate amount of time for a victim survivor to be getting back on their feet in terms of being able to pay that for themselves. I would also just a couple of words on the Scottish Welfare Fund. They are normally limited to 3 in any 12 months, and a local authority doesn't have to consider an award if an application on the same grounds has been made in the last 28 days. So what that means is if the abuser has been applying for the Scottish Welfare Fund while they were living together, it can sometimes compromise the ability of the abuser, of the victim survivor, to access an award. We also do see some delays, particularly with community care grants. But overall, they are an absolute lifeline for victim survivors facing homelessness, particularly.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, Lynn, if you wanted to come in on that.
I mean, I think what it strikes me as it's a very complicated system that women and children have to navigate through, and my colleagues are the technical experts, but I think what Abba hears on a daily basis is women's and children's experiences of a really complicated system and processes that they have to navigate, and actually, as I said before, at a time that they need support the most. It's just often not there. It's fragmented, it's complicated, and actually the cost to our state is often higher if women and children have to go into homeless accommodation or overinflated private rented accommodation. And they're the things I think that we need to consider going forward is, can we make small payments to families? Can we get more money in the pockets of families when they need it most? and actually offset the cost to higher costs of having families in homeless accommodation. So yeah, these guys are the technical experts, but I think the experts from families that we support tell us on a daily basis just how hard it is, just how difficult it is. And actually I would really call on our systems and processes to be trauma informed but uphold children's rights at the same time.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thanks, Lynn. I think Liz would like to come in.
Just on that interesting point you raised, what kinds of simplifications would you like to see to make things easier?
Is this in reference to Scottish Welfare Fund or
Lynn was arguing that women and children find it very difficult to navigate the system, which is obviously creating difficulties. Can I just ask what the simplifications you would like to see would be to try to overcome that?
Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, my colleagues are the experts in terms of the benefit entitlement part of it, but I think actually just having funds available for women to access would be really simple. As I said before, things like early financial advice at the time that women and children need it, specialist advice. We've heard women and children getting advice that's wrong and therefore sets them on a different pathway. So those are simplifications. If we get money into families' pockets, then it means that they have more choices.
So does that mean a special fund?
I think that's one of the things, yeah, that would definitely help. And I think some of the simplifications that we can make in the benefits system, so if we have much more trauma-informed advisors, assessors, and actually are there things that we can do right now? So I think there's a pathway we need to create in Scotland, which is about, which, as I said before, upholds the principles of equally safe, because that's what we've signed up for, that's our strategy, and yet what we're seeing is that the systems that we have in place don't do that. They don't help women and children leave in a safe way, and actually women and children who face the greatest inequalities are most affected and therefore are less likely to be equally safe. So I think when we're looking at things like legislation and changes to the benefit system, we have to do impact assessments, human rights and children's rights impact assessments, and what does that actually mean for our families in Scotland?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and come Kirsty.
Just really to say that the pilot of the Fund to Leave was really intended to help people navigate the complexities of the system. So it was a bit of breathing space almost, financial support to give you the breathing space to access the support that you need and to be able to navigate the complexities of the system, which is why we thought it was so important in the first place.
That raises an interesting point, though, about whether, in order to help those who are most in need, is it better advice and support that they're requiring, or do we actually need to find an additional pot of money that is specific to their types of needs? Because these are two different things.
So I think the additional pot of money is needed in order to help people access the advice that they need. That because of the situation, because of the way that things like universal credit are set up, that in order to be able to plan to leave, you could have advice, but the social security system at the moment isn't responsive enough to be able to help you leave immediately. And you may well be leaving in a situation very, very quickly. And we need something that is responsive enough to help you in that situation straight away, whilst you are able to navigate all the different places that you might have to apply for money from: Universal Credit, Scottish Welfare Fund, discretionary housing payments. There are so many different sources of support to be able to apply to all of those things in kind of one snap moment is not possible.
Okay, thank you.
Erica? Add to that, I mean, our advisors are, of course, helping victim survivors navigate an incredibly fragmented and complex system every day. And I think what is needed is absolutely access to advice is indispensable. But that genuine, immediate safety net that transcends all of that complexity, I think, it would signal a very deep respect for victim survivors. It would signal that we're listening to them, that we're advocates, we're allies, and as well as providing that practical help and that sort of deep psychological reassurance as well that comes from knowing that that cushion to get yourself restarted is available to you, and in order to have a safe, future-facing exit from that relationship as well.
Okay, thank you. I believe Bob Doris would like to come in.
Yeah, again, just briefly, I think there's a theme coming out of all of this about a victim survivor needing the certainty in advance of taking that massive decision that is to get out of that abusive relationship. And I get for some of a crisis moment and you have to flee, there's very specific circumstances there. But for many, from what we've heard, the decisions kind of made over time. There's a certainty and a clarity, but a lack of support and a pathway, I think, has come up. I want to explore whether there is enough money in the system already. If the DWP gave certainty up front and with privacy to the victim survivor that if they left, here's the cash they would get and it wouldn't be in advance. If discretionary housing payments could do the same, if the Scottish Welfare Fund could do the same, do we start getting to a quantum of cash in a system that the victim survivor may eventually get anyway, but fragmented over time with great uncertainty, where they could do something meaningful and a more dignified way to get out of an abusive relationship?
If you don't mind, Kirsty, I think that we need a bit of both. I think we need those designing in of victim survivors' needs into the universal credit system, and potentially a little bit more discretion in relation to the Scottish Welfare Fund and expansion, potentially a bit of discretionary housing payments. But you're still looking at a number of different agencies and you're still looking at that complexity. So the beauty of the Fund to Leave is it just transcends all of that. It is very clear. And I think it would also avoid a lot of downstream costs. Potentially there'd be a lot less need for recourse to Scottish Welfare Fund and discretionary housing payment in particular if that Fund to Leave was there in combination with some basic design modifications to universal credit.
So it's both, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to people that are subject to immigration control in the context of a domestic abuse setting, what do you think that the Scottish Government can do to maximise the support there? Kirsty, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, just to note that we're really pleased that the Scottish Welfare Fund guidance has been amended to make it clearer about who can get support from Scottish Welfare Fund in relation to immigration status. That's been a big step forward. Again, we come back to the permanent Fund to Leave. Many people who are leaving domestic abuse are not able to access benefits. And that makes the decision to leave so much harder, because without financial support, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? And the pilot Fund to Leave, we know it wasn't on the list of public funds, and that meant it was available to people. It wasn't restricted. And that, again, that does help people establish that initial point of how am I going to establish myself? Where am I going to get access to help from, particularly when it's going to be so much harder to get any access to help. We would like to see guidance developed for local authorities, specifically about supporting people who are subject to immigration control and have no recourse to public funds, but specific to those who are escaping domestic abuse. We know that there is guidance available, COSLA's developed guidance, but it doesn't meet the specific needs of people who are leaving domestic abuse. And I think that can incorporate looking at how can we make the most of payments through things like Section 22 of the Children Scotland Act, and how can we make the most of payments through Section 12 of the Social Work Scotland Act to people who don't have access to social security in its traditional sense, but who do require financial support.
Okay, that's helpful, Erica. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just echo everything that Kirsty's just said and just add to it that in that guidance it would be really useful if there was more awareness at local authority level of the Home Office's domestic violence concession. If I can actually speak from personal experience in my advisor days there, it is enormously helpful. It is life-saving. It really does help women escape, because even though it's just a 3-month period, having that access to public funds for that short space of time for victim survivors who don't ordinarily have recourse to public funds, and potentially, I'm sure local authorities are well aware of it, but potentially if there was more kind of clarity of joined up use of that. When a victim survivor presents in distress at a local authority, they're aware that that's available.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Lynn, I don't know if you wanted to make any comments on that.
We would support that. I think, you know, the more that we see families in destitution and actually that there are some solutions that are already available to us, I think we need to ensure that our local authority colleagues know how to take that forward. We've also seen Aberlour, as you know, in our submission, shared that we directly, through our Urgent Assistance Fund, give 3.3 million since 2023 to families who need financial support. 1 in 5 of those have experienced domestic abuse, but we're seeing a rise in families where they have no recourse to public funds. So we would support the calls from our colleagues.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to invite Gordon MacDonald in. Thanks.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, panel. We've spoken a lot this morning about how we need to get more money into families' hands. I think it was you that said that, Lynn. And of course, the Child Maintenance Service was created just to do that. How effective is the Child Maintenance Service in the context of domestic abuse? And I'll come to you, Lynn, since I used your quote.
So again, my colleagues will be much more expert in terms of the technicality around child maintenance, but we've got evidence through experience from our families where child maintenance payments have been stopped and or used as a coercive controlling mechanism. We recently heard from a family where that was the case, and she then had to be forced into other sources of debt to survive. So that story is not unique. There are many stories. So again, we need to ensure that the Scottish maintenance payments are effectively upholding the rights of women and children, and make sure that women aren't put at further risk during that process, because we've heard from women that is the case. But I'd hand over to my colleagues who would know more about the technical aspect, but definitely it's an area that we would want to see changed.
Okay. Erica, how effective are they?
Well, we actually, strangely enough, we actually advise more non-resident parents than resident parents, interestingly. But what we do see is a deep reluctance on the part of victim survivors to go anywhere near claiming child maintenance, which you can understand that there's no contact, of course, very often between the former partner and the victim survivor, and that's for very, 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 very good reasons. So we do see a very deep reluctance, people feeling unable to pursue child maintenance through the service or any other way for that matter. And when a child maintenance payment arrangement is then up and running, we do see that victim survivors are facing some challenges, like a long lag time between income changes and reviews. So quite often they're aware that ex-partner is now earning an awful lot of money, and the level of maintenance can take quite a long time to change, because there's a 25% income change threshold before an early review would kick in. We also see a lot of difficulties in evidencing cash in hand earnings. So victim survivors are aware that ex-partner is earning a lot through cash in hand work, and that's not being reflected in the level of maintenance being paid. Final challenge that we see is, in some cases, when child maintenance is received, it can sometimes tip women into an income threshold where they no longer qualify for a minimal asset process bankruptcy, and they then have to go into a full bankruptcy and pay a contribution. So that's a particular challenge, of course, for victim survivors who've been left with a lot of overhanging debts from the relationship. So, yeah.
So just before I bring in Kirsty, you've made a list there of things that have to change. So how should the Child Maintenance Service go about making those changes, and does some of them require legislative change?
I think a lot of it is about communication, if we're frank, and about arming victim survivors with the tools to navigate the Child Maintenance Service system as well. So I'm actually part of a working group that's doing some work around that just now on building a toolkit for both resident and non-resident parents, to be fair. But we know, of course, that lone parents or so, that there disproportionately have been a background of economic and other forms of domestic abuse here. So again, it's about perhaps more trauma-informed awareness, particularly the number of lone parents, obviously, that are coming through the child maintenance service. It's all about that level of communication and awareness of what the background might potentially be when a victim survivor is approaching that service.
And Kirsty, the same question about the effectiveness of child maintenance and what needs to change.
So we would refer to One Parent Family Scotland report from September 2024 that said that the CMS was ill-equipped, despite improvements, to support families who had experienced domestic abuse. Gingerbread UK, in one of their reports, commented that 45% of parents who had experienced domestic abuse who were using the child maintenance service found that the use of the child maintenance service led to an increase in the abusive behaviour. So we can, I think that just demonstrates that the child maintenance service really isn't working in the interests of families with domestic abuse. We would support One Parent Family Scotland and Gingerbread in their calls for a review of the child maintenance service, but putting much more onus on the focus of the reduction of child poverty for lone parents and removing the onus from the parents to administer it almost themselves, and particularly domestic victim survivors and women.
So just on that last point you made about having to manage it yourself, there is a consultation just been announced by the DWP that they are going to be taking the, if I've understood it correctly, the payments in-house, so that the parent without care will pay directly to the CMS, and the CMS will then pay it to the other parent. How effective will that be, given the issues that you've raised?
I think that depends on things like, one of the issues at the moment is that the parent with care has to initiate a lot of the claim and to pursue it, and then whether or not DWP will guarantee the payments and how much enforcement they're willing to carry out as well.
Okay. Erica, you got anything to add?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. I think as part of the group that I'm with that's working on the toolkit, we would certainly be supporting that call for a review of how it works overall to better support. And to be fair, it's across the board. You know, we need a system that potentially works better for all parties, including paying parents. You know.
And just one last question, just for my own benefit. If there is a disagreement between the parents about the level of child support that should be paid, there's a whole process that the CMS have highlighted about mandatory reconsideration, appeals and complaints process. What is the sort of average timescale for that process to go through, and you know, how satisfied are people at the end of the day with that whole process?
Usually it's sort of fairly typical for sort of 12 to 18 month kind of periods for all of these sorts of challenge processes, and of course that can also depend entirely on the level of cooperation from the individuals involved, which obviously clearly varies a lot.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, I believe Jeremy Balfour would like to come in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I suppose just to follow up on this, I mean, clearly I don't think we want to go back to the system before this, where the people went to the Sheriff Court and it was all done through the Sheriff Court. So, can this be solved by fundamental change, or do we need to look at a completely different model of delivering this and almost take time and start again with something completely different? Or could this be made to work better with large changes?
I think a lot of this is potentially about giving victim survivors a little bit more control and autonomy, as opposed to complete radical removal of the system. I mean, we all know that the ideal arrangement would be for parents to have amicable agreements on them, but you know, world as it is and all that. It's things like the way that the charging system can be abused if things like that in the basic operation of it were looked at, as opposed to necessarily needing to radically overhaul it. And again, I go back to equipping parents with the information that they need to effectively navigate it, and equipping the agency with the tools it needs to properly support victim survivors and potentially to support them to resolve disputes more effectively. We know that solicitors have to handle this every day, and there's potentially, a lot of kind of learning out there, a lot of co-production that could be done to just generally improve the operation of the service as opposed to radically overhauling it.
I think we would refer to One Parent Family Scotland and Gingerbread calls on how they think the system should be reviewed. I think they've done a lot of work with parents and have the expertise, so I would rather refer to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, so that concludes our questions, and thank you very much for joining us today and for the excellent written submissions that you provided us as well. So we'll have a short suspension to allow for a change in the witnesses. Welcome back. So our next item of business is a roundtable discussion on the UK Government's welfare reforms. And I welcome to the meeting Hannah Randolph, Economist Fellow, Fraser of Allender Institute. Fiona Colley, Head of Public Affairs and Communications, Carers Scotland. Chris Burt, Associate Director for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And Emma Jackson, Head of Social Justice, Citizens Advice Scotland, who are joining us in the room. And we have Dr Sally Witcher, Director and Founder, Inclusive New Normal, who is joining us online. Thank you. So the meeting is a roundtable format, which we will hope that we can get us a free-flowing conversation. And the committee is very much in listening mode today. And if you want to speak, and for those of you that are online, then if you just let myself or Diane know as well. So we're going to sort of focus on 4 main themes today, and we have about an hour and 10 minutes to go over the evidence session. So I just encourage members and witnesses to be as succinct in your questions and answers. And I'm now going to invite Liz Smith to introduce the first theme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. I think the most important thing for this committee just now, as we're looking at all this welfare reform, is to try to drill down on the evidence, as in what works and what is clearly not working so well. And thank you to several people around the table who've done some great work through their different agencies trying to provide that evidence, because that's immensely helpful to us. And just before we get going on some of the other things, I would be very interested to know from you, in the context of obviously a very difficult debate about welfare reform that's taking place both in Westminster and in Holyrood, as to what evidence you think is the most important in telling us or showing us the direction in which we should be going to try to get the best possible returns for people who are most vulnerable. That's the big question I think we're all facing. Dr Randolph, you're an economist. Fraser of Allender. Would you like to start us off?
Sure. So I think the thing that strikes me most is that we know that in the past the projected decreases in cases from cutting benefits have not always materialized because people change their behavior. Yeah. So I think one of the important things when I was coming here today was to say that we don't know that cutting benefits will result in a fall in caseload. And so we have seen a rise in caseload, and it's a bit unclear if that's because of rising prevalence or a rise in the people who have some sort of long-term health condition or disability claiming an entitlement that they already have. And so that certainly needs to be unpicked a bit. But I'm sure others will have more to say about what they think is driving that. But we do also know that a lot of the rises are coming from mental health claims, and also there's been a fairly marked rise in musculoskeletal claims since prior to the pandemic. So those seem to be the areas of focus.
And do you think that that's particularly difficult to measure, because it's obviously very sensitive and it captures quite a lot of psychological illnesses as well as mental illness? Do you think that's very difficult to capture? Because I think another question that the committee's been wrestling with for quite a long time is how can we balance the need of benefits for those who are absolutely, genuinely in need against the desire to get more people back into work, because that's governments are struggling with this all over the world, particularly post-COVID. And I'm just wondering how easy it is to measure, particularly when it comes to things like adult disability, how easy is it to measure just how many people could actually go into the workforce if they were well supported?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to measure. But I would say from speaking to people who work in employability, the focus needs to be on the right job. And so there has been success for people with long-term health conditions and with disabilities if they're supported into work, if it's the right job for them, if it's something where they can work with the employer to create the right conditions in the job for them. And so I think that there's good work going on in Scotland with the specialist employability services that are available to try to advance that type of thing.
That's very helpful.
Yeah, I wonder if I can add something into that. I think that it's laudable to attempt to provide additional employability support for disabled people. It's been sorely lacking, but I think what the debate within this has failed to recognise is, one, the right type of employment, but two, the role of public services within this. Employability support is one thing, but what are the services around to enable people to be in employment? I was at a Carers in Employment conference yesterday, and there was a number of carers talking about employability, and they were talking about the fact that social care services and support services simply are not there. And if they're not there, the support that somebody needs to be in employment cannot be provided. And removing social security and the foundations that they have in their life does not actually help in the slightest, and you will be starting to make people more ill physically and mentally.
And greater anxiety, I'm sure. Yeah.
Emma would like to come in?
Yeah, please. I think to answer your question, Liz, around what evidence that we have to look at, I think we must begin this conversation at looking at the disproportionate levels of harm that disabled people are already experiencing right now. Disabled people face some of the worst of poverty here in Scotland and across the UK. The Citizens Advice Network, of the sort of almost 200,000 people that we provide advice to annually, more than 2/3 have a disability or long-term health condition. And we know that disabled people need advice on multiple issues, including housing, food insecurity, energy debt, social security. And our advisors are seeing firsthand the harrowing choices that ill and disabled people are being forced to make daily, which includes things like skipping meals, not being able to turn the heating on, not being able to charge essential medical devices. And we know that this has a devastating impact on people's physical and mental well-being. And the context where we are right now from the starting point is that so many disabled people do not have a sufficient income to be able to live from. So the premise that we would be considering reducing the incomes of those who already do not have enough to live on is simply unconscionable. We know that poverty is both a cause and a consequence of disability, and as that has been obviously a direct reason for why we're seeing kind of some of the increase. So I really think we must begin our conversation at looking at the experience of disabled people now and the solutions that need to be put in place before we have any type of conversation about what needs to be reduced or taken away.
Sally would like to come in.
Hang on. Am I unmuted? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So first off, just to say, this is very short notice. I'm not prepared. So I reserve my right to follow up with a written note saying something different. But my starting point is that in order to understand what is driving the rising claims, you have to get to grips with that. And the reason for it is the fact that we still have an ongoing COVID pandemic. There has been, and if you look at the stats, if you look at the figures for the trends in PIP claims, it shows you that they were relatively stable from 2013 until about 2021, and then they shot up. And if you look at the stats on the kind of inflows, the new claims, if you could bear with me, I will tell you what they are. So, so where are we? Yeah, so working age PIP onflows, new claims, increased by 98% from 175,000 in 2018-19 to 348,000 in 2022-23. So I think you have to ask the question, why that was. And it wasn't the fact that there was a sudden outbreak of idleness. It was the fact that a lot of people were getting very, very sick and becoming disabled. So the fact is, we are still dealing with this, that COVID has destroyed people's immune systems. People have got long COVID, it's not being monitored, the data isn't there. So, and it causes massive damage to all kinds of health issues, including heart attacks, strokes, brain damage, reductions in IQ. So there's all kinds of issues going on here. The health of the working age population has got worse. Long COVID is most experienced by people of working age, possibly due to workplace lack of safety. So, and then we have to think about whether employment support is the answer. I was formerly the chair of the Disability Employment Advisory Committee for the last UK government. And I have counted the number of different programmes for employment support since 1945. There have been so many of them. There was even another Pathways to Work programme when I was chair of this committee. And it has never really made much of a dent. It helps. I'm not saying it's not a thing to do, but the reason why disabled people are not in work isn't because they lack employment support. And that is, there are many other reasons which I don't have time to go into now, but which I will be pleased to follow up on. Thank you.
Sally, I believe Liz wants to come back in and then Chris.
Just a quick question, Dr. Witcher. Thank you very much for your comments, particularly about the COVID pandemic. If you look at the OECD material, Scotland seems to be struggling more than other countries about getting people back into the workplace. And I just wondered if you had any reflections about why in Scotland we've got these specific problems, whereas other countries seem to be coping a bit better. Sorry.
I think I think there isn't really time to go into that today, but there are many factors to look at, including things like economics, the economic trends, because what happens around disabled people's employment rates is that when the economy increases, the rates between non-disabled people and disabled people narrow a bit, but more slowly for disabled people. When there's a recession or it goes down, the first people to lose work are disabled people, usually because the kinds of work they're in is precarious, part-time, short-term. So, there's a whole raft of different issues here. And obviously the issue, we need to look at what the health service and mental health support. Because if you take the fact that the reason disabled people are not in work is because they are sick, because they are disabled, because there is an increase in mental health issues because of huge struggles around living in this era, huge anxiety, well-founded anxiety, not pretend anxiety that's all in your head. But there's also a lack of good data. I don't think we even know how many people in Scotland have long COVID now, or any of these conditions which have wiped out, that's an exaggeration, that have done a huge amount to damage the economy. And there's a lot of international research around this, including on the economic impact. So I think we have to look wider. It is about the state of services, the reality of illness, disability, the fact that employers cannot employ people who have serious fluctuating illnesses, who may be able to work very well for a few weeks and then not for weeks, months, days. You have to look at it from the employer's end, because a key reason disabled people are not in work is because employers either will not or cannot employ them. By problematising disabled people, by saying they are the ones that are the deficit, they are the ones that need support, you're missing the picture, you're missing everything about why disabled people are not in work. They can't work, employers can't very often employ them. When they can employ them, they often don't. because the discrimination is not, laws are not well enforced, and actually even if they were, are really quite hard, quite challenging to prove. So yes, we need to look at, basically my message is, your starting point is completely different. What happens in social security is an indicator of wider economic and public health failure. Now, the extent to which that is different in Scotland, I would want to give further thought to, and which I simply haven't had time to do since I was invited to appear, yesterday afternoon to be here this morning. Thank you.
Okay, I believe Chris Burke would like to come in. Thank you.
Sure. In terms of some evidence gaps we have around these reforms, which I think are really important, we know a lot less in Scotland about the overlap between the health element of universal credit and ADP recipients, because they're now handled separately. I think it's pretty shocking that the UK government haven't done more to connect. I know Social Security Scotland are digging more into the kind of number of people who have different points, etc. But I think that's a big risk. We also don't know yet how people in Scotland will be assessed for the health element of universal credit. That's a big gap in our knowledge as well. But it is important to note the things that we really do know. Emma's already set out the extent of poverty, destitution amongst disabled people already. I mean, I won't go into detail here. I mean, we could write a book on it. People have. So I think the other thing to look at the spike in new claims, Hannah's colleagues at Strathclyde Uni saw this. The IFS did work for JRF down south on this. Claims for disability benefits are concentrated in areas of higher deprivation. New claims are concentrated in areas of higher deprivation. Poverty drives demand for these benefits. And on welfare reform, and I'll put reform in inverted commas, we have evidence on this. We've seen the austerity changes to universal credit have not reduced poverty. They have increased employment to an extent, but because Social Security was cut at the same time, people's incomes haven't gone anywhere. And we also see people disadvantaged within the labour market, often disabled people, women, people from minority ethnic backgrounds, are doing poorly and being discriminated against in the labour market. So the outcome is net no change in the hardship that we have seen over years. And one thing on the employability thing, I mean, Sally and Fiona have already set out a lot of this, of employability, and this is the same for everyone, really. I mean, we see employability as something very simple, but it's really not. The barriers to work for people are complex. But it's also a sense of scale. So, for example, there's been work done looking at the additional employability support that the UK government are promising. There's estimates that could help 45 to 90,000 people at a UK level into work. Now, these cuts will impact on millions of people, but also just as a comparator, the Scottish Government has a goal of halving the so-called disability employment gap in Scotland. In Scotland alone, that would mean increasing the work of 120,000 people in Scotland. The UK Government's commitment to additional employability, we're looking at increasing employment for 45 to 90,000 people across the UK. The sense, the frustration that's felt of the lack of scale, urgency, social care, transport, healthcare, employers, as Sally's spoken about. These are big structural problems that we have in our economy that all these reforms will do is make worse, and they don't touch the edges of the real issues that people face.
Okay, sorry, thanks, Chris. I believe Fiona wants to come in, and then I'll invite Sally back in. Thank you.
Yes, just very briefly, I think the role of care responsibilities needs to be considered, and caring as a social determinant of health, and the reforms of the potential to have a doubling of impact for people losing the health element, but also losing their carer support payment or anything attached to that. We know that a third of carers in Scotland are disabled, and that's compared to 24% of non-carers. And over a quarter of them said that they had bad physical or mental health, and both of those figures have increased since the last time that we did the survey a year ago.
and 2/3 were struggling to make ends meet, and worryingly 14% are using food banks. These are all contributing to poorer health, and we need to tackle so many different issues, but for carers and disabled people, these are structural issues, and we need to make big progress in them.
Okay, no, thank you, Fiona. Sally, I believe you want to come in. Thanks.
Yes, quickly. One thing I missed out. The pace at which claims are processed and the dropout rate can also be quite a big factor. So the more resources, the better, actually, the faster claims are processed. That can also mean that the amount of claims, of new claims, looks higher. So one thing I'd want to look at is if during the pandemic, the pace slowed because people were off sick or in lockdown or whatever, and then once the emergency was over, that there was more resources put into processing a backlog. So something like that could make a difference in terms of what the figures are telling you. And finally, just to say that it's important to understand the backdrop to this. I mentioned that disabled people have already borne the brunt of austerity. If you look at what the UN committee has been saying, they've accused the UK government of gross and systematic violation of disabled people's rights when they looked at the UK state parties' records on benefits. It was described as a human catastrophe in 2017. And then literally in March this year, another UN committee urged the UK government to make good the devastating cuts that there had been to disabled people's benefits. That was literally a few weeks before the UK government announced these cuts. So we need to understand that the starting point here for disabled people is extreme poverty. And there is simply nothing left to give here. 87%, 88% of people on the lower rate of PIP and ADP would lose support. That is huge. So let's not underestimate how devastating these cuts could be.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback here. I'm going to move on now to theme 2, which is the impact of the UK reforms on disabled people and their carers as well. And I'm going to invite Marie McNair. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. It's great to have you with us this morning. Obviously, the Disabled Charity Scope have said that it could push alone, I think it's 250,000 people into poverty, including 50,000 children. Do the panel agree with that assessment? And I'll open it up to whoever wants to come in first.
Chris would like to come in, and then I'll invite Emma back in. Thank you.
Well, yes and no. I think in some of the UK government's communications around this, I'll choose my language parliamentarily, it's slightly misleading in that our analysis shows that maybe 400,000 people would be driven into poverty, because what they've done is they've counted the previous cuts, which the previous UK government were going to make changes to work capability assessment. So I can provide the committee with that analysis if it would be helpful. I mean, Sally very eloquently set out the position that disabled people are already in. I mean, I've got a list of various stats that I could put on here. But one thing I would really encourage members to do is, if it ever does come to a vote in this Parliament as to whether or not to copy the changes that the current UK government are making, have a look at the criteria for how people are scored for PIP or ADP, and the things which get you 2 points. So UK government is about, you have to score 4 points to get that standard allowance, which Sally was talking about. Have a read of those scores, of 2 scores, and see if you can add up a few of them to get to 8, and think, do those people not deserve support? I think it will chill you to read some of those, and I would really encourage people to do it.
Yes, I believe Emma wants to come in. Thank you.
So we would absolutely point to the analysis that organisations that JRF have done in terms of trying to point to some of the impact that's believed that these reforms could have on people. And I think we really need to grapple with the fact that this will have a catastrophic and far-reaching impact on sick and disabled people and their families. It is undoubtedly going to push more people into debt and into destitution, with devastating impacts on people's physical and mental well-being. None of this is hyperbole. It is the reality of what we will see, and we absolutely must grapple with that and do everything within our power, I guess, to prevent these from happening. Citizens Advice Scotland is ardently against these reforms and have been doing everything that we can to share our evidence and insight with the UK government. I think one of the things that deeply challenges us as we look at these proposals and that is really important for us to grasp is the fact that both PIP and ADP are intended to be known as an enabling benefit, an enabling payment. They're there to cover the costs of the additional costs that it means to have a disability or a long-term health condition. They're not means tested, and they are not linked to a person's ability to work. I need to say that again. They are not linked to a person's ability to work. And by narrowing the criteria, we're going to see some pretty devastating things. The changes that are being proposed to change the daily living component that Chris has already highlighted. I want to go a step further and spell out what some of that means. It's going to include taking points away for things like preparing food or managing incontinence. And I don't know about you, but I think accessing food and being able to go to the bathroom are pretty foundational in all of our day-to-day lives. And to think that as a society that we might not want to value that and to enable someone to do these absolutely fundamental things is really quite difficult to grapple with. And so therefore, if people are not able to eat properly or to use the bathroom, how on earth do we think that those people will be able to maintain and hold down the jobs that they already have? Citizens Advice Scotland provides ADP advice to a significant number of people all the way across Scotland, and from those who access ADP advice from us, over a quarter are in work. ADP type payments are enabling people to access work and to independent lives and to hold that down. So removing or lowering the payments like this could have a direct consequence of removing people from the workforce, which I think is just completely nonsensical in terms of the overarching goals that these reforms are allegedly trying to move towards.
Well, thanks, Emma. That's really helpful. I don't know if anyone else... I think Sally, I believe Sally wants to come in and then I'll bring Fiona in. My apologies, Sally.
Yes, indeed. I mean, someone's already said that the kinds of things that you lose, you would not score more than 2 points for, include things like not being able to wash below the waist or dress below the waist without assistance, needing prompting or supervision to go to the toilet. So people are going to lose support for that, but they will be offered, presumably, support to, I don't know, prepare for a job interview, maybe to get their CV in shape. Let's be realistic here. Let's also understand that some of those costs will get displaced onto local authorities. So it's just going to move the money around. So it isn't going to help. If you look at the total costs, which has been described, I believe, by the Chancellor, the UK Chancellor, as pocket money, the total potential cost that could be lost is in the region, for a household including carers, of about £14,000 per annum. Now, I don't know about you, but it doesn't feel like me to pocket money. And if that's what ministers are paying their kids, pocket money, they might want to rethink that. I mean, seriously, that is huge. And even people on the lower rate are going to lose I think it's about 8,000, which is massive when you've got no money. And as for carers, I'm sure Fiona will have the most up-to-date figures on this, but the amount that unpaid carers already contribute to the economy is something like, Fiona will say, is it £184 billion a year? Would you not think that's kind of enough? We're going to take more money off them? I mean, this is disastrous. And it's not an isolated attack. They're removing social care. care workers will not get visas. It's just coming at us from all sides. People can't get healthcare. Healthcare does not understand some of the conditions that people I work with have got. They don't know what they are. They can't test for them because they don't understand them. And people are being left to rot. So I honestly don't know what's going to become of disabled people. I mean, maybe they'll get upward assisted suicide and assisted dying. Maybe that, I mean, I'm not joking. I mean, people with ME, it was at the meeting yesterday, it was said by one of the speakers that the leading cause of death for people with ME was suicide, one of the leading causes. It's grim. I've never been more, I've worked in this area for over 30 years and I've been scared before, but I've never been quite this alarmed at what's happening.
Thanks for that. It's absolutely brutal. I mean, you know, I thought it was 250,000, but, you know, thanks, Chris, for clarifying the 400,000. I mean, this isn't just numbers, there's real people behind this. And I think, Chris, obviously, some of your kind of briefings have been really helpful. The case studies you provided, Fiona's touched on it earlier on as well, but obviously the one that I was looking at was obviously a single person losing PIP in the health element of UC. It was meaning £818 less a month, and I think that was equivalent to kind of a deduction of like 10,000 a year. Can you provide any kind of further examples of how people have been impacted, and obviously as well, for example, how it's going to touch those who are already in work?
Maria, yeah, I think Fiona was wanting to come in as well, so I'll bring Fiona in just now. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that I think these cuts, and let's call them what they are, will be devastating for disabled people and for carers. We don't believe there's a sufficient understanding of the impact on carers, the knock-on impact. We can talk about things like loss of carers allowance or health elements, but actually, what does that mean to carers' employment? We know already about a third of carers have to give up work to care, and people reduce hours. They take lower paid jobs simply to manage. The fact is that people will continue to care. Removing funds doesn't mean that people will stop caring, nor, incidentally, does it remove disability or ill health. But we think there's significant work needs to be done on the cumulative effect, for example, on parent carers and the impact on child poverty. We already know that carers who are either caring for a disabled child or who are caring for someone else and have parental responsibility for a child under 18 have a greater chance of poverty than other carers in our surveys. They're far more likely to be in debt, and they're twice as likely to be cutting back on essentials already, such as food and energy. And of that group, they're 10% more likely to have given up work to care, and a third more likely to have reduced hours. I think also we need to think about some of the things that the other services that are around that. Around half are worried about the increases in rent and mortgage and how they're going to afford that. Already, 7% have been forced to sell their home because of their caring role, and the levels of struggle on the very basics like electricity and gas, transport, food, rent or mortgage, repairs to the home are higher across the board for parent carers and for those caring for a child who have a child under 18. And the levels of poor mental health are higher than for all carers. So the assessment of impact does not take into account those cumulative impacts on individuals who have multiple roles, and we are all people who have multiple roles. Someone may be a parent and also have a caring role. Maybe even, and a number of carers in the survey were caring for 2, 3, 4 people. And what happens if we remove the financial support from them? Caring doesn't stop, but their poverty will increase and in fact, will end up in destitution.
And have carers in Scotland been consulted on those cuts? Sorry, back to yourself, Fiona.
Sorry, I didn't.
I'm saying, have carers in Scotland been consulted on the proposed cuts? Has there been any consultation so far?
We are directly consulting with carers, specifically around stuff around the health element, because that is part of the reserve benefit system. But we are currently consulting with carers to actually bring their voices into the consultation through ourselves, through the national carer organisations, and through our colleagues in Carers UK and the other carer organisations across the UK about what this will actually mean for carers.
Thank you.
I think Emma would like to come in.
Just very briefly on the point of consultation, Marie, I think we absolutely have to acknowledge the fact that not all of the proposals are being consulted on. Some of the ones that those of us from the third sector have the deepest level of concern on, there is no public consultation taking place. For example, what we've been discussing about the narrowing of the PIP criteria. So the fact that we are not able to actively engage, first and foremost, disabled people and those who work alongside them and with them in organisations really is of deep concern. We also feel very concerned as well about the specific lack of in-depth and meaningful consultation about the particular interaction of these reforms with devolved social security. I guess primarily our concern is here in Scotland, but I'd also refer to colleagues in Northern Ireland as well. So there are some real kind of concerns there about how this is being consulted on so that the right level of information can be gathered.
Marie, would you like to come back in? Sorry.
No, I'm okay, thanks. I'll hand it back to yourself.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone else would like to come in before we move on to the next theme. No. Okay, I'm going to invite Jeremy in then. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla, and again, thank you all very much for coming this morning. I want to, under this theme, kind of explore two areas. And the first one's been picked up just there by Emma and also by Chris, because at the moment, ADP, which I should probably acknowledge I'm in receipt of, and PIP, the criteria are almost identical for most individuals. And obviously, ADP gives you into passporting to other benefits which are then reserved at present. If the PIP criteria changes and the Scottish Government don't decide to go down that road, what concerns do you have that the UK Government may then not use ADP as a passport to those benefits, and what implications would that have for people here in Scotland? Chris?
I think it's a huge concern, and as I say, I think the UK Government have been bordering on flippant about the extent of these issues so far. You know, consultation documents and the other documents just kind of blithely kind of state we need to think about this. Hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland, Northern Ireland impacted as well. So, and I think, you know, this committee or its kind of predecessor's consideration of the transfer from PIP DLA onto EDP is, I think, you know, a lesson on you know, some of the fear that Sally has spoken about. A clear message that this committee heard and the Scottish Government heard was about disabled people wanted stability, predictability. Things have been really flipping hard for years. Do this carefully, please. And this is a perfect example of how not to do it. I think the absolute core principle, which the UK Government and the Scottish Government will have to cooperate with, whether they like it or not, it is incumbent on the Scottish Government to cooperate with the UK Government on this, must place the burden on the bureaucracies to make these decisions, not on individuals. The idea that people in Scotland would have to go through another assessment on top of the separate assessment they have to have for UC at the moment and for ADP, to then have another just to get the health element of UC, I think has to be seen as completely unacceptable. And Emma has highlighted a key point, which is a problem with the current proposals anyway. The assessment for PIP or for ADP is not related to somebody's ability to work. The work capability assessment, by its very name, is. Those are different calculations. Now, so we have concerns down south about people who currently don't get PIP but do get the health element of UC, what happens with them? But so there are fundamental differences in these assessment processes already, and then there is the chance that, you know, if the Scottish Government weren't to copy what the UK government are doing, you'd still be kind of asking the same questions. So maybe there's a data sharing thing, but what if the Scottish Government were to significantly change eligibility for ADP and, you know, heaven forfend, increase its adequacy? You know, these are difficult questions, which I do think it's very problematic that the UK government haven't, and they need to take time and get this right. This is one of the things. Some of these things look rushed. They're not being consulted on. They're being hammered through to balance the books on the back of disabled people, and I think it's completely unacceptable.
Emma?
Yeah. Yes to everything that Chris has just said. I won't repeat because I know that we're pressed on time. We agree that there seems to be a huge lack of insight in the relationship between devolved and reserved payments here. I think for us the biggest concern that seems to be rising to the top is around the passporting element, that ADP can enable other people then to receive other parts of the social security system. The direct link to carer support payment perhaps is one of the ones that comes to mind, and just none of it's clear. None of it is known at the moment, and therefore it's quite hard to give exact kind of recommendations when there isn't clarity. I think as well we need to think about other things that are happening within our social security system here in Scotland at the moment. So as committee members will well know, we've been carrying out a review, an independent review of ADP, which has been bringing up some really interesting things. And there will be a series of recommendations that will come to the Scottish Government in the very near future around ADP. And it's hard not to feel that there is a divergence in these two approaches in terms of disability and health-related payments. And therefore, the most important thing we have to think about is what does that mean for individuals. Chris is absolutely right. The burden cannot be placed on an individual. We see that day and daily across the Citizens Advice Network, where individuals in Scotland are having to navigate two social security systems, which is administrative and can be complex, perhaps even despite some of the best efforts of government to work together. And so the fact that we would think about adding more complexity and more burden into a system is really quite difficult to comprehend. We know that social security uptake is not as high as we would like and need it to be. Social security is a right, and people should be able to access the payments that they need. And any level of complexity is going to place barriers in front of people to be able to claim the things that they're entitled to. And outwith of the administrative barriers that people are facing, I think we've got to acknowledge the impact that this conversation that's been happening of late has had for disabled people. The language and rhetoric surrounding this has been deeply villainising, trying to portray people as somehow not needing these payments or swinging the lead or all of the horrible language I don't think I want to repeat here. And that is having a very significant impact on people right now, even before we've seen any of these potential reforms go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think Sally would like to come in. Jeremy, thanks.
Yes, thank you. I gave evidence on the complex ways in which the two systems are interconnected and the potential constraints on devolved power that those could constitute. That was to this committee in, I think it was November 2023. And my fear is that these cuts will inevitably and unavoidably significantly constrain what any Scottish Government could do to exercise devolved power. Now, some of these are questions, but I think they're questions I've not seen answers to. I'm particularly interested in how the fiscal framework would apply, but also potentially Article 14, human rights, on just discrimination and inequitable provision. So basically, if PIP assessment is to be the assessment for universal credit and such like additional payments, structurally adult disability payment would fulfil the same function. But if ADP eligibility are better in accurately reflecting and accommodating people with severe functional limitations who currently are excluded, and I'm working with many of them, what would happen? Would it still serve as that route? And even if it didn't do that, even if it was just significantly different to pick, then we have two different processes to grant access to the same thing. So if they decided that yes, it would continue regardless to provide access to universal credit and such like payments, how would the fiscal framework apply? Because that says if the Scottish Government does, as I understand it, the Scottish Government does something that causes the UK Government to incur extra costs, Scottish Government pays. So who would meet the additional UK Government costs in universal credit payments? And then you've got as I said, Article 14 of the EHCR, which is part of the Human Rights Act. So if eligibility criteria for reserve benefit vary without a justifiable reason and have a disproportionate impact on a vulnerable group, and it's sort of inequitable, then that potentially, I think, could be challenged. So, but even then, if there was no additional, if they did decide that it didn't serve as a passport or a route to getting those payments, there would need to be an additional assessment. And again, under the fiscal framework, I don't know who would pay for that. So I think these are important. You know, I hope I'm not just casting a shoal of red herrings at you, but these are questions which I think would be worth just checking out, basically.
Okay. Thanks, Ellie. That's noted. I believe Fiona wants to come in. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to say I've not got any answers to any of those questions, but I did want to highlight other interactions with devolved systems, particularly around employability and thinking about young disabled people and the resources being switched to an expanded youth guarantee, and what would that mean in Scotland, and how would the UK Government work with the Scottish Government to develop that? I mean, we have general concerns around that change. It is a time where young people with a disability or long-term condition and their carers transition is a really, really difficult time where services can reduce, moving from children's services to adult services, and that point about stability at those times is really, really critical. And I think that the Scottish Government has invested in a reopened ILF fund, for example, transition support through that fund for young disabled people, and actually are replacing additional barriers to they and their families by changing the support that young people who already get less support financially from the social security system. So I think there's some, we've got some questions around that, but I think the specific one around the devolved systems around employability.
Thank you.
Can I thank everyone for the answer? But I think it is disappointing that both the Secretary of State for Scotland and the Secretary of State for Welfare have not been willing to come and give evidence to this committee, because I think the questions, particularly by Sally, are ones that we as a committee would want to pursue, but are unable to do so due to their lack of availability. I am conscious of time, Convener, so if I can move us on to the $1 million question, or in fact the $1 billion question, and that is, the Scottish Fiscal Commission have identified that by 2930, so the next Parliament, that the Scottish Government will need to find around about £2 billion if we are to continue down the road that we are going. Now that can either be found by more money coming from the UK Government, it can come from tax raising powers here in Scotland, although they are limited, or it can come by cutting other services and other budgets. I appreciate a question that none of you want to answer, but what would you suggest for the next Scottish Government do in regard to finding this £2 billion? I'm going to start with the Economist, first of all.
That is the £1 million question. I think that one thing to consider really carefully is the point that Emma made earlier about cuts to disability benefits in particular, just placing more pressure on other services and on local authorities. So this is not necessarily an area where you can where you would make direct savings, and that's something to be aware of. And there was a question, I think, in the meeting documents about fiscal sustainability. And so we do have some devolved social security, and there's been concern over higher spending in the Scottish system on certain types of benefits, and particularly disability benefits. But that is why we have the devolved system. And so I think it's really important to remember that it's devolved so that we can make different decisions in Scotland, but we need to be aware of maybe where the money's coming from. And I don't have easy answers, unfortunately, about where the money could come from, but maybe Chris has some ideas.
Yeah, Chris has got the answer. Yeah.
Really easy. I just think, politics is all about choices. And obviously, and I think you're hearing a chorus of people telling me the UK government are making the wrong choices in these areas. But our social security system has been withered now for years. It causes poverty. There's loads of evidence to show that. And I just think the order of magnitude of the mitigation of these changes to disability payments is significant. There's no denying that whatsoever. I will have been guilty of rolling my eyes sometimes at the Scottish Government saying, we just have to mitigate all this UK government stuff. But this is the right thing to do. And this isn't even getting us particularly far. It's just stopping things from getting a lot worse. And I completely understand for any politician who has to defend other decisions around spending on this, but it is the right thing to do. And frankly, if I were forced into this decision, I would rather stand on a doorstep and defend modest tax increases than making disabled people destitute. And I think that is the choice that people face. That's the choice politicians take on by doing their job. And so be it. Maybe it's not as easy as that, but...
Thanks, Chris. I believe Sally wants to come in, and then Emma. Thanks.
Yes, so I go back to what's actually causing the rise, what the trends are based on. So presumably the projections are based on current trends and projecting forwards. However, if you go back to what's driving it, this is not inevitable. The trends can presumably be changed. If what's driving it is unmitigated airborne infections, ongoing illnesses as a result of that. If you could do things to change the numbers of people becoming sick and disabled, then those figures are going to change as well. So it's about, it's about being tough on, if I can put it, sickness and disability rather than tough on sick and disabled people. If they go ahead with these cuts, what will happen is precisely the opposite to what's intended, because it will make more poverty, will make people more sick and disabled. It will make them less able to work, because as somebody else, I think it was Emma, said earlier, PIP helps people into work. It means because it's about extra costs, and you have extra costs when you're in work. So it's going to be so counterproductive. All that will happen, and it will displace money elsewhere. It will displace expenditure onto local authorities and elsewhere. And ultimately, disabled people will, if those can't accommodate it, will go under. So you have to go back to the start. And the start is unmitigated sickness, unaddressed sickness and disability. And you may think this is a very odd suggestion, but I would say if there was one thing Scottish Government could do to make a difference here, it's to take air quality indoors seriously, because the pollution in there, the infection in indoor air is what is driving so much sickness and disability. And we see this in the NHS near Clacks every winter, when it's overwhelmed by airborne infection, and yet there is nothing done to prevent it when they could.
Okay, thanks, Sally. I believe Emma wants to come in, and then Fiona. Thank you.
I think, like others have said, just for the purposes of repeating it, we cannot allow this to happen here in Scotland, and we cannot follow suit. It is an eye-wateringly staggering bill, that mitigations to cover the cost of these mitigations. But I would urge the committee and indeed the Scottish Government, if it comes to these decisions, to think about the cost of what it would be to service the failure demand from this and the impact on other services. It will be astronomical, and the long-term impacts of that will last for generations. So we really can't take a short-term view on that. In terms of some of the long-term actions that are needed, I absolutely agree with Sally. We have to look at the systemic issues that we have as a society and to continue to prioritise those, perhaps the most pertinent being tackling poverty. We need to continue to make that a burning platform and the number one issue that we're looking at here in Scottish Government. And if we are to have any chance in meeting the legally binding child poverty targets that this Parliament has set, if we do not put mitigations in place to support disabled households, I don't know how we would ever make a chance in kind of meeting these. All of these are really inextricably linked. So tackling poverty is of critical importance, as is investment in public services. We've spoken about the things that disabled people need to access to attend work and to live independent lives and to be able to stay healthy and well. So investment in the NHS, in care services are absolutely critical. And I think we need to continue as well to make sure that employers are fulfilling their responsibilities to deliver on the duties that they have under the Equality Act, to make reasonable adjustments so that disabled people can not only access good jobs but maintain them. So these are all of the same things that need to happen, and I would argue that happen at the same time, both so that we would have a chance in dealing with the short-term issue in front of us, but so that we could think long-term and have some ambition here, so that disabled people would be able to live decent and dignified lives with sufficient incomes.
Thank you. Fiona?
I'll be very brief because Emma said it much more articulately than I can, but I think that whatever decisions are made, and I would absolutely urge that we do not follow suit in relation to ADP, and we find a solution in relation to the health element and universal credit. But we actually need to look at what are the causes of ill health and look at tackling those and think holistically about those rather than thinking of things in isolation. And I think we do a lot of thinking of things in isolation. We think of reducing waiting lists, which absolutely fantastic, but then not necessarily think about how do we support and provide the right social care to discharge people from hospital. So we're just thinking of things in boxes, so we really need to think of them as a whole.
Thank you. I think we're going to move on now to the last theme, which is abolishing the work capability assessment, and I'm going to invite Bob in. Thanks.
You know, I kind of think in the round that's what I'm speaking about for the last wee bit, to be fair. So if there's any additional comments on that, please do. I think we've heard about how we might have to have an alternative system in Scotland, that relationship with DWP about do we have to have an alternative assessment process if the Scottish system diverges from the UK system, how that will all work. I think we've done all that, Convener. I can raise one or two other matters if you thought that would be helpful, but I think that, so primarily if there's any further comments on abolish work capability assessment, please raise those, but I think we've covered most of it. I thought in my head, though, was in relation to those getting the health element of a universal credit. Once you abolish the work capability assessment, it's not clear who will be pressurised into seeking employment and who won't be, and when conditionality actually kicks in relation to that. So I wonder if there's additional concerns in relation to that aspect. I think that would be quite helpful to hear about. And I hate to make matters sound worse, Convener, but do witnesses think there's been a deliberate blurring of PIP as a entitlement for those with disabilities in its own right, and the fact that it's not related to being in work? Do you think there's been a deliberate blurring of that? And if there is, could we be looking in the future at looking where you're getting your PIP and you're getting a health element of UC? Should you be getting both? Nothing I would ever suggest in relation to that, of course, but is there a wider direction of travel that the UK could be going on that could be seriously damaging further to those living with disabilities. But primarily this theme was supposed to be on work capability assessments, but I think we've kind of fleshed most of that out with Jeremy's line of questioning, I think. Does anyone want to take up the cudgels of the kind of wider thoughts that I've given? Fiona?
Potentially not the second part of the question, but we do have concerns over the a new conditionality regime. I mean, certainly there is talk within it of it feeling softer, more supportive, support conversations, but what do those actually mean? But the reality is for individuals, disabled individuals and unpaid carers, more will fall into that regime of conditionality. And for a carer, not being able to fulfil it. And we see that happen to carers, where a person has lost their disability benefits and may well be in the process of appealing it. They do fall into the conditionality regime. And as I said before, just because financial support stops doesn't mean disability and caring stops. And I think we have real concerns around that.
I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I could give you a long rant on conditionality if you've got the time. I mean, I think like the massive cut to the health element of UC is particularly worrying because, I mean, whether or not it's been a deliberate blurring, there certainly has been a careless blurring of the means tested and non-means tested elements of it. So by their very nature, people who are currently in receipt of the health element of UC are poorer and are at great risk of destitution, and we see that showing up in food bank use, etc., etc. And I think this whole thing just talks to system, like the right to try policy, right? That is something which disabled people have talked about for a long time, about that risk of being able to going into work, but if it doesn't work, you've then got to go through a process. But even just the name, the right to try, it implies that disabled people, their carers, are not currently trying. And the distrust we heard through this Parliament in the DWP in terms of the previous PIP and DLS system, and yet the UK government is trying to push a line of don't worry, we'll help you out more through this system that you don't trust with condescending terms like right to try. We require a complete reset of this. And I do think this talks to both Emma and Fiona have talked about it, is we have a deeply unfair and unequal society at the moment. We have extremely high levels of poverty. 41% of people in receipt of disability benefits, when you take those out of their income, are in poverty. These are the causes of what drives part of this demand is driven by we have an ageing population as well. We have an ageing population, an impoverished population. 25 years gap in healthy life expectancy between our poorest and our richest communities. That is shocking. We won't make progress on this until we get into those structural causes, until we flip the conversation on its head. We don't talk about people being far away from the labour market. The labour market needs to get closer to them. Until we look at it through that prism, we will continue to fail.
Thank you. I believe Sally wants to come in and then Emma. Thank you.
Yes, that was a very interesting suggestion, I thought, about putting all extra costs in one place and separating that from out-of-work benefit. And that would, one of the key challenges for the way the systems are structured is how closely they're interconnected and how one of them does rebounds on the other. And so to do what the Scottish Government could do what it can to disentangle, that would massively increase scope potentially for devolved power to be exercised. As for blurring of what PIP is, I honestly, if you look at the social media, which I try not to, nobody understands out there that PIP isn't an out-of-work benefit. They just don't get it, and they would not understand why people have extra costs in work that even access to work won't meet if you can get it after waiting for however many months. So it's not understood. It's not understood that PIP helps people get into work by providing some income security, and it enables people to take up low-paid work perhaps they otherwise might not be able to even attempt. The right to try is a good idea, but my question is, how will that work for employers? Because if it doesn't work for them, it isn't going to work. And ultimately, you have to look at it from the employer's lens, because what I would like to see is employers being subjected to the kinds of sanctions and grilling that sick and disabled people could well find themselves subjected to. You know, they need to be grilled as to, well, why can't you employ disabled people? Why can't you employ this person? And sanctioned if they could, but are not. I mean, let's just turn it on its head, because I think then you would have a sense of, you know, if the jobs aren't there, the employers really can't. And I honestly think for some people, they could if they understood reasonable adjustments and how to construct job descriptions and so on, which they don't. But in many cases, people are too sick and disabled to work, and employers cannot employ them. And you need to get your heads around that. Doesn't matter how much you sanction. People are not out of work because they lack motivation, or that they don't know how to do a CV, or that they need help with interview technique. You know, really, yes, that may apply to some, but it's a tiny number. So, yeah. But I do like the idea that was mentioned about you need to start thinking more creatively here, and and test out some other options.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to invite Emma in now. Thanks.
In terms of the sort of particular questions about WCA, there's lots more that I could say, but we did provide a written submission to the committee, and I would ask committee members to look at that, and I would particularly highlight the section on something called substantial risk. We have deep concern about that. I think more generally, to sort of answer the last kind of part of your question, I think one of the big things that Sally and others have kind of touched on is just the real lack of clarity from all of this, and confusing and conflicting messaging, and the impact that it's having on people. First and foremost, we must acknowledge the real and deep impact that that's having on disabled people and the fears and worries that they have. But I think we also really need to consider as well the impact that it's having on advice services like the 59 Bureau of Cabs that are across Scotland. And our advisors are telling us that people are coming already now who are absolutely terrified about what's happening. And cabs are bracing themselves, I guess, for an onslaught of demand of advice at a time when they've never been busier, or the issues that individuals are facing have never been more complex. So there's going to be even more demand. And I was recently speaking to the Chief Executive of Glasgow North West Cab, one of our busiest cabs. And I actually just want to read a bit of a quote of something that Alana said to me, because I think it is so powerful. She said, "We've already seen a spike in demand from people asking what this is going to mean for them. People are so worried. I don't know how much more they can take. Or our advisors. How do we tell even more people who are cold and hungry, facing mountain debts and deteriorating health, that there is nothing else that we can do for them to increase their incomes? This is going to be devastating for all of us. We're entering into this new period from a position of much deeper and ingrained poverty. In all honesty, I think all we have left to strip from people is their humanity."
Thanks, that is very powerful. Thanks, Emma. Don't know if Marie wanted to come in with a supplementary.
It's just going back to the assessment. You know, I understand that the existing assessment of whether someone is entitled to limited capacity for work and work-related activity in UC includes that consideration to whether the claimant would be a risk to themselves or others in the workplace. And I believe that this won't exist after the changes. So do the panel think that having no assessment of the claimant's ability in the workplace undermine that suggestion that these changes are about helping more people into work?
Somebody like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just repeat what I said earlier. I think, you know, the PIP or ADP assessment and the work capability assessment are fundamentally designed to do two different things. And I mean, I think this is something, I'm looking at one of my colleagues at a chart, this is something I think they are consulting on. So I think this is definitely something I need to consider, but Emma may have more detailed opinion.
Okay. I mean, if the information's not available right now, we can always get back with a written submission as well. Yeah,
I would
rather
point
than
our
putting you on
written
the spot.
submission. Yeah, we've picked it up there, and I'll point to that.
Okay, okay. I don't know. I'm conscious as well. We've got Paul O'Kane on the line. I don't know if you wanted to come in, Paul, on anything.
No, Convener, I said I would indicate if I wanted to come in.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Okay. So I think that kind of concludes all our themes in terms of the welfare reform. So can I just say thanks for your really powerful evidence today and for the excellent written submissions that you've all provided us with. And if there are any points that you've not had a chance to raise with us today, again, you're more than welcome to follow up in writing as well. So that concludes our public business for today, and we will now move into private. Thank you.